I'm sure it's very busy today at Ocean Sciences, so getting to our virtual booth here at OOI might take some people a little longer, but let me just get started. So for those of you who weren't at yesterday's session, I sort of want to introduce myself. I'm Jim Edson, and I'm stepping in as the new principal investigator for the OOI Program Management Office, and I'll be taking over the reins from John Trowbridge. And so I just want to say I'm very excited about the opportunity, but I'm also realizing that I'm stepping into John's very big shoes. And so as such, I just want to thank John, the Program Management Office, the IOs at Oregon State, University of Washington, and Woods Hole for handing me such a well-oiled machine, thank goodness. And I sort of promise that I'll continue to work with these groups to improve the way that we acquire and deliver data. We can always make improvements to things. And for that, I will be reaching out to the scientific community, most certainly, also the federal agencies, and of course, the general public who pays for all this, for your input. And so that's gonna be the goal. We're gonna keep delivering high quality data, and we'll try to do it more effectively and efficiently as moving forward. And we'll be adding things that we probably don't even think we're gonna be adding or have thought about, but believe me, it's gonna get better and better. So you have not tuned in to listen to me. So going back to today's program, I'm really delighted to introduce our panelists. These are OOI users, and they're gonna provide example using OOI data of how we can improve our understanding and our ability to predict extreme events, all right? I'm actually a marine meteorologist, so I love extreme events. I don't mind studying hurricanes and severe winter storms, for example, and I use OOI data to do just that. So today's speakers, though, include Chen, who's a physical oceanographer and assistant scientist at Woods Hole. And he's going to lead these things, the whole discussion off with marine heat waves, but in the Atlantic. All right, that's a little different than what Hillary Scannell is going to do. She's a postdoc research scientist at the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University. She's going to follow to share what she's learning about the marine heat waves in the Pacific. Okay, so I can imagine some really good questions from the audience about comparing and contrasting these two different regimes and how they're being impacted by climate change. And then last but not least will be Ed Deaver, who will present his observations on extremely high PCO2 events in the Pacific. Now, Ed is a PI for the Coastal Endurance Array. That's part of the OOI on the West Coast. He's also a professor at Oregon State University. So I'm really excited to hear what you guys have to say. And so just with that, I'll turn it over to Ka and take it away. And while you're getting that set up, let me just, one more thing. Please feel free to ask questions on chat during the presentations, okay? And we'll answer them in between. And then also there should be plenty of time at the end for a question and answer period where I'll just ask you to raise your hand if you could. All right, so sorry about that, Ka. So please now take it away.
All right, thanks, Jim. Also thank Darlene and thanks John for the invitation. So today I'd like to talk about the driving processes of a recent marine heat wave in the Northwest Atlantic Coast Ocean. And as you will see later on, this is a subsurface advective marine heat wave. And I'm going to show you that how OOI data helped me to understand the physical processes. But first, I'd like to briefly introduce the oceanographic setting. So here you are looking at monthly mean sea surface temperature in March of 2012 for the region of interest, the Northwest Atlantic Coast Ocean. And the mean circulation in this region includes an equatorward shelf current, so going from north to south. And offshore Gulf Stream is pushing poleward. And between the Gulf Stream and the shelf is the so-called slope sea, which is a very dynamic region where warm cold rains and Gulf Stream meanders can have a big impact on the oceanographic environment. So because of the high latitude influence, the shelf water is generally cold and fresh. in contrast to warm and salty slope water. And separating the two water masses is a front, and that is dynamically trapped along the shell break, roughly at 200-meter isobath. So this region, the Northwest Atlantic coastal ocean, has been experiencing long-term and spatially coherent warming. So the top panel you are looking at is a time series of seasonal temperature anomalies over the Northwest Atlantic shelf. So spatially averaged anywhere between Labrador and Cape Hatteras. And clearly you can see a long-term warming trend across 4 different SST products. And that warming rate is roughly 0.4 degree per decade. And that number is actually getting larger in recent years. So on top of this long-term warming, you do see large interannual variability with extreme events, and that is marine heat waves. So which are defined as ocean extremes with large temperature anomalies. And the most prominent marine heat wave in the Northwest Atlantic so far is the one in 2012, which you can see here set the record high temperature for the past 100 plus years. And marine heat waves such as the one in 2012 can have widespread impact on the physical and biological environment in the ocean. So that's why we need to understand the driving processes leading to those extremes. So that's a necessary step for a potential prediction. So now in 2017, another marine heat wave happened in this region. So here I'm showing you 2 histograms, one for depth average temperature on the left, and the other one for depth average salinity on the right. So the 2017 conditions are marked in red. In comparison to all historical values collected in this region over here. So temperature anomaly in January 2017 was about 4 degrees, and that's actually exceeding 98th percentile. And for salinity, it's above 1 PSU anomaly, and that's exceeding 97th percentile. So truly, this event was very anomalous. And what's more interesting is that this is a so-called compound extreme event, meaning we have a large anomaly in both temperature and also salinity. And this compound nature actually is an indication that this event is more likely driven by oceanic processes, because atmospheric forcing should not be able to produce such a large anomaly in salinity. And we have some evidence to support this idea. So here you are looking at the 6 AVHRR SST images from November 2016 to February 2017. And quite clearly, you can identify a few warm core rings in close proximity to the outer shelf. So we know that warm core rings are very important in terms of changing shelf and slope oceanographic conditions. So it is reasonable to think that warm core rings were driving those water mass anomalies showed up in the observations. That's actually what we hypothesized. So what we think happened was Gulf Stream warm core rings was able to bring warm and salty water onto the shelf. And then that water mass anomaly sort of rise on the main along shelf flow going to the south, and then finally exit the shelf in April of 2017. Because of the advective nature of this event, we call it advective marine heat wave. So warm core rings driving water mass anomalies, this is a reasonable hypothesis, right? And especially the temperature and the salinity anomalies have been verified by some of the regional observations, as shown in this map. But still, there are a few important questions to be answered. Number one, whether or not warm core rings are indeed driving the water mass anomalies or driving the subsurface marine heat wave. We were not able to do a thorough proof simply because existing data are not enough. And number two, what is the exact working mechanism? So we know that the shelf break is an effective barrier in terms of inhibiting water mass exchanges between the coastal ocean and the open ocean. So for the water mass anomaly to propagate across isobath, some higher order dynamics must be present. And also, what about other factors like atmospheric forcing during this event? So answering those questions is the central motivation of this study. Now to do that, the first thing I did is to look at OOI pioneer array observations. Now here you are looking at salinity recorded at 2 profiler moorings from the Pioneer Ray, one from the upstream inshore site, which is here, that is shoreward of the 100-meter isobath. And next one is from the central inshore site, which is here, that is offshore of the 100-meter isobath. So color represents salinity, and the 34.5 isohaline is marked in black, which is the location of the shellbreak front, separating the shelf water and the slope water. So the time axis goes November 2016 to February of 2017. So from those two panels, one thing you can see clearly is there seems to be two high salinity events, one in late 2016 and the other one in early 2017. And this seems to be bottom intensified, meaning you tend to see higher salinity in the deeper water column. And this actually has an indication that these high salinity events are likely driven by onshore migration of the shellbreak front. Now, looking at some additional observations, this is from the mid-shelf. So I'm comparing the depth structure of temperature and the salinity. So basically, I'm comparing the profiles in 2017 to the climatological conditions. And then the corresponding anomalies are shown in the last column there. So the profiles are not evenly distributed in time. But if you look closely, you can identify two periods of sort of a high salinity, high temperature events, one in November, and the other one in January. Okay, and then the January anomalies generally are larger than those in November. And also, although the anomalies are bottom intensified, the January anomalies seems to be extending through the water column. So again, this is another indication that the temperature and the salinity anomalies are likely driven by oceanic processes as opposed to atmospheric forcing. So to try to figure out exactly what happened, I turn to numerical modeling. So for the sake of time, I won't bore you about the technical details. Instead, I will just say that this model does a pretty good job in resolving the temperature and the salinity evolution, both spatially and temporally. And overall, RMS error for temperature and salinity are very small. That's indicating a very good model scale. So before I tell you what happened, I'd like to give you a quick preview. So basically, there were two periods of a significant onshore intrusions. Like I said, one in November and the other one in January. And they both seems to be associated with offshore cyclone eddies. So the process is more like a two-step working. The first step is for the cyclone eddies to precondition the outer shelf by two processes. One is to change along-shelf pressure gradient, and number two is to induce frontogenesis. And both will actually facilitate the water mass exchange at the outer shelf. So that's why I call it a preconditioning. And the second step is really wind-driven bottom intrusion from the shelf break all the way to inner shelf. And what's unique about this intrusion is it is localized along a bathymetric feature. So for this talk, again, we don't have enough time, but I will only show you the second step, which is the wind-driven bottom intrusion. So now you are looking at the bottom salinity in color, along with ocean currents in vectors for the last 6 days of January 2017. So as you can see here, during these 6 days, the wind is blowing from west to east, so upwelling. The direction is pretty persistent, although the wind direction starts to fluctuate in the last 2 days. So as a result of this upwelling wind, you do see a general onshore migration of the high salinity water. For example, if you focus your eye to look at the leading edge of the high salinity water mass, on day one is roughly along the 100-meter isobath, which is, by the way, the thicker contour here. But after 6 days, that high salinity water already moved past the 100-meter isobath. So this is consistent with our understanding of the classic two-dimensional wind-driven circulation, right? You have a wind blowing in the same direction as the shelf orientation. You will have an onshore migration of the shelf break front. But I think the most interesting and the most salient feature you can see here is this localized intrusion right here, which extends from the shell break to almost 50-meter isobath. So that's quite a large spatial distance there. And the horizontal scale is roughly 30 kilometers. So if we take a cross-section cutting through this intrusion, we will see that this intrusion was indeed bottom intensified. The vertical scale is roughly 10 meters. So within 5-6 days, the high salinity, high temperature core actually extended from the shell break to, again, almost 50-meter isobath. And that's a distance larger than 100 kilometers. And if you do back of the envelope calculation, you can get an advection speed of 0.2 meters per second. So I should mention this is a remarkable number because this is the same magnitude as the equator-ward shell break jet. I should also mention that the intrusion seems to be isopycnal, meaning the temperature and the salinity anomalies are caused by the onshore migration of the isopycnals. But we do see signs of diapycnal mixing, for example, from this vertical spreading of a high salinity water, which should not be surprising because this is in the middle of winter. You have a very intense heat loss at the surface and also wind mixing is strong. Now the question is, what is driving this bottom intrusion, right? So here I'm showing you the bottom pressure gradient field for the 6 days in late January 2017. So color represents the magnitude and the vectors are telling you the direction of the pressure gradient force. So I should mention that the major balance over the course of the 6 days is between Coriolis and pressure gradient. So the salient feature you can identify here is this localized setup in pressure gradient, or what I call it, a tongue-shaped setup. So this is actually consistent with the onshore intrusion. For example, if you look at panel B here, so we have a higher pressure gradient setup at this location, right? So it's pointing to northwest, the pressure gradient force. So the resulting onshore flow should actually be pointing to the northeast. And that's actually what you see here for the same day. Also, in the last 2 days, because of the relaxation of the upwelling wind, this pressure gradient setup gradually disappears. And that's actually corresponding well to the disappearance of the onshore intrusion. So I think the message here is relatively clear. That is, the localized bottom intrusion over the 6 days is driven by the same spatial setup of the pressure gradient field. But still, you may wonder what is contributing to this pressure gradient, right? So I'm going to use this schematic to briefly explain. So here is a simplified representation of the shelf topography. So on the right or on the east, you are looking at the southern New England shelf, this region. And on the west, you are looking at the New York Bight area, so here. So the wind is blowing from west to east, and that's the same in the real ocean. For the eastern shelf, we can think about that traditional two-dimensional wind-driven model to help us understand the processes, that is offshore Ackermann transport and elevation of sea level offshore, and also, of course, decrease of sea level near the coast. And for the western shelf, because the wind direction and shelf orientation do not align, so there will be Ackermann transport in both cross and also along shelf direction. So then the intersection between the western and the eastern shelf will be sort of a convergence center. So you will have a more water mass accumulation, therefore higher barotropic sea level setup. And on the western shelf, because of the along shelf Ackermann transport, which will bring additional water mass away from the local region, that will decrease the barotropic sea level setup over there, right? So this will essentially create a higher pressure gradient setup, largely barotropic, right at the intersection of the western and the eastern shelf, which is basically what you see here from the model. So I should mention that this, the process here are different from the traditional two-dimensional consideration. That is, the along shelf bathymetry can effectively shape the bottom intrusion process. So now we'll stop here. I think the takeaway message here is the driving processes of marine heat waves can be very different if we consider different geographic setting and also different type of events, for example, surface heat waves versus subsurface heat waves. So that's why we need more effort, to better understand the driving processes before we can say something for sure about their prediction. So with that, I will stop.
Very good. So I'm going to ask you to unshare your screen so Hillary can get hers on. In the meantime, do we have any quick questions? I think actually, does one of the panelists have one question?
I'll ask a quick question if we can.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is a local process driven by the changes in bathymetry, but I guess, are there any larger scale processes that are contributing? Like, this is a pretty unusual heat wave. For example, are the development or number of warm core eddies changing over time that we see, or are there changes in the atmospheric forcing in the wintertime that contributed to this event?
Excellent question. Yes, I can say at least two things. Number one, there is a trend in terms of the number of warm core rings. So if we project that linear trend forward in time, we tend to have more warm core rings to make the outer shelf saltier and warmer. So even if the wind condition is the same, like the frequency of upwind and wind is the same, you have a saltier and warmer base to work on. So that still will create more intense, like this type of intrusions. And also for this event, warm core rings were quite active during this period. So I would say the preconditioning process is also one important consideration for this type of extreme intrusion.
Great,
but
thank you.
Excellent question. Thank you, Dan.
Very good. So nice presentation. And so now we're going to hear something completely different, perhaps, from Hillary. So Hillary, why don't you just take it away? Look good.
Awesome. Okay. Hi, everyone. So my name's Hillary. And I actually just transitioned out of academia. I'm at a private company now as a data scientist, but this is work that I actually started during my PhD that came out about 2 years ago. And it was in response to a marine heat wave that was called the Blob 2.0 in the Pacific Ocean. And so looking at this event, we wanted to compare and understand how the second marine heat wave, Blob 2.0, was different from the original blob that happened in 2013 to 2014. So I'll be using a series of subsurface observations to, again, show you the structure of temperature and salinity and density between these two events and to show you how they're similar and different. I didn't know where we'd be starting for marine heat wave, so I have a little bit of background that might not be too interesting to you all, but nevertheless is important to kind of start with that there's been this very large warming trend over the global ocean, but that trend is not homogeneous everywhere along the globe. Some places are rising, the temperatures are rising faster than others. And this is in part why we get stronger and more frequent marine heat waves in certain regions than others. And it just happens that the Northeast Pacific seems to be a spot where we're getting these really persistent and intense marine heat waves that are occurring more frequently. And this is just a demonstration of thinking about these extreme events in different regimes. So this first regime is where we don't have a warming trend. And so this is a synthetic time series of temperature. So where it's yellow, it's warmer than average. Where it's blue, it's cooler than average. And when you don't have a change in temperature, your extremes are there's equal chances of having an extreme cold event and an extreme warm event. And these extremes happen within a range that many species can cope with. And so we're not too concerned about this. However, now we're in this climate that is warming rapidly. And so we have these more frequent and extreme unprecedented warm events that we haven't seen before. And so that means that the ecosystems and the species haven't experienced these abrupt shifts in temperature before. And so this leads to really devastating impacts on ecosystems. And this really hit home, I think, to folks in the US in the winter of 2013, 2014, when we had the blob happen. And, we had mass die-offs of species, we had seals being stranded. And so there's a big urge to understand, why these events occur. Are they going to occur more frequently? And a lot of work has been done since that original marine heat wave. I think less work has been done looking beneath into the subsurface. And so that's kind of where I want to shine some light and some new information in regards to the subsurface structure and persistence of these warm events. As you know, so these marine heat waves are, we're defining them as these really intense warm water events that exceed some threshold. And so Chen showed that you use like a 90th percentile of the distribution of temperature anomalies. And then when the temperature exceeds that, we consider it a marine heat wave. There's many different ways you can define a marine heat wave and categorize them, but simply it's when the temperature exceeds some threshold. And as you know, these marine heat waves just don't happen in the Atlantic or the Pacific. They happen across the globe, and their spatial extents, their intensities are quite different depending on the local oceanography, the local atmospheric dynamics and things that are driving these marine heat waves. So this is just a nice map that I took from a paper that just is a composite of these different extreme events that have happened over the last 2 decades. And so I'll be focusing on the Northeast Pacific in this box area, where 2 pretty large scale marine heat waves have occurred in the last, 7 or so years. Okay, so the 2 events that I'll kind of focus on here are, again, the blob and the blob 2.0 is what I'll kind of refer to them to as. And you can see that they hit the same spot. This is a map from the maximum temperature anomaly averaged within this boxed region. And so you can see January 2014, that was when the blob really had the maximum temperature anomaly in this area. And then again, in November 2019, you kind of see a similar pattern of warming. And everywhere where there's these diagonal lines, that according to our definition for a marine heat wave is when a marine heat wave was occurring in that particular location. But for the purposes of this, we're just focusing on this boxed area. So it's quite offshore from where a lot of the OOI data is. And for that reason, today I'm showing a lot of data that comes from in situ observations from satellite ships and buoys. Maybe less so buoys in this area, and then also Argo floats. And we have lots of Argo floats in this area. So a lot of times when we look at marine heat waves, we're just kind of stuck looking at these surface maps of sea surface temperature. But if you look below the surface, you can see that the temperature anomalies actually extend pretty far down into the water column. So on the very bottom panel, I'm showing you the subsurface temperature that we have from mapped Argo float data. So this is autonomous profiling floats that go up and down the upper 2,000 meters of the water column. Here, I'm only showing you a slice of the upper 280 meters. And you can see that's where really the warming is confined. It doesn't really extend much further below that. But yeah, the magnitude of warming at the surface is large, but it also propagates downward and persists for much longer than it does at the surface. And so I thought that was really remarkable, thinking about their long-term impacts and their possible reemergence. So in 2019, again, you see that really intense surface warming and those warm waters starting to propagate downwards. So now let's peel back some layers to figure out what was causing that anomaly to so easily propagate downwards. So to begin, I'm going to take actually just a single Argo float from the Gulf of Alaska. And so that's marked here by the star in this map. And so we have data for temperature, salinity, and then density. And we can take the anomalies over the course of this Argo climatology from 2004 through present. And so we're removing the seasonal cycle, removing the mean, but we're keeping the trend in this time series. So again, for the subsurface temperature, you see those very strong warming events from the blob in 2014 and the blob 2.0 in 2019. The dashed lines are actually isopycnals, so lines of constant density, and you can just see where some isopycnals outcrop every winter and some never do, so they're below the isopycnal. And this gives you a sense of how the density is changing due to those temperature and salinity anomalies. If we look at salinity, this is where it really gets interesting. The 2014 through 2016 event was really salty. That salty anomaly was actually maximum beneath the pycnocline, whereas in 2019, it was actually met with a very fresh anomaly, and that was driven, that was really at the surface. So there's lighter water at the surface, and it created much lighter surface water, so the upper layer was more buoyant. We looked at some of the causes for why there was this really large freshwater anomaly that started back in 2018. And we think that partly it's because there was a really large input of precipitation kind of in the northwestern part of the Gulf of Alaska. And that likely had contributed to the surface freshening of the water near the surface. So unlike in the Atlantic, where that salinity anomaly was really at the bottom of the ocean, this one was really at the surface. So we think that that was driven by atmospheric fluxes of precipitation, which you can see here in these maps. So what does that do then to the buoyancy or the stratification of the upper water column, and how do these two events differ in that regard? So now we can just kind of take a peek at the density, and it was kind of hinted at by looking at the depression of those isopycnals, but the density is much lighter during this period, during the second marine heat wave, and that's primarily due to the salinity freshwater anomaly. So surface warming and freshening lowers that surface density. And if we look at two profiles of that density, so I'm picking those same dates where the sea surface temperature anomalies were the peak during those two events, you can see that in 2019, how much lighter that surface water was in the upper 25 meters. Using these profiles of density, we can actually calculate a stratification metric or anomaly to see how more stable the water column was during one marine heat wave or the other. And so we call this the bulk stratification anomaly, and you just take the densities of the the difference in densities between the surface and 200 meters. And we do that for every single month that we have data. And if we plot that bulk stratification anomaly out, you can see where it is positive. That means you're increasing the stability of the upper 200 meters of the water column. And then here you can obviously see that 2019 kind of blew 2014 out of the park. It was really stable due to that freshwater anomaly. And on the left are just the maps of that bulk stratification anomaly for the two times that the temperature anomaly was peak. And so you can see that both had positive stratification anomalies. So they were both pretty stable, but 2019, because of that freshwater, was much, much greater. And so this has really important consequences into how easily that surface temperature anomaly can actually get into the subsurface. Again, so here is the subsurface temperature with the mixed layer depth now overlaid on top. The mixed layer depth was actually calculated based on an algorithm from about 20,000 Argo profiles, individual profiles, averaged in this or taken from this area. And during the first marine heat wave, the wintertime mixed layer never got as deep because of that stratification of those warm anomalies. But in 2019, it was actually during the summer where that mixed layer depth was deeper than average. And the otherwise, the mixed layer depth didn't really respond too much to those warm anomalies. The differences in seasonality here is that the 2014 event happened in winter. It was initiated in winter, where in 2019, it happened during the summer when the mixed layer is pretty shallow to begin with. So To take this a step further, we just looked at the heat content anomaly too in different layers. So these are equal thickness layers. And I just checked my time, coming toward the end. So you can see that in the upper layer, you have this really large heat content anomaly. And this is the due to the temperature change driven by the atmosphere. But then as you look deeper in the ocean, you see that that heat content anomaly penetrates down, but it takes a longer time. Takes longer time for it to get to the subsurface. But once it gets into the subsurface, it persists for quite a long time, even after the surface cools. All right. So some main takeaways from this study that we did was that in 2019, near surface temperature was very warm and fresh. And so that lowered the density of the surface and increased the stratification. That increase in stratification likely inhibited this surface marine heat wave from penetrating as deeply as the 2013 to 2016 event. Because it couldn't penetrate into the subsurface, it was kind of stuck near the surface. It actually could enhance the further buildup of surface heat. And so as we look into the future, trends tend to favor a more stratified upper ocean. And so we don't think that this detrainment mechanism of heat out of the mixed layer is going to be as effective in the future to pretty much alleviate that stress from the surface by mixing it downwards. And therefore it might further amplify surface warming. And so that is the conclusions that I have here. And I do think as far as, predictability and thinking about the persistence and the long-term impacts, I think a lot of promise could be looking into the subsurface where there could be this reemergence year after year if enough heat is trapped below the mixed layer. And so that's a short-term predictability, perhaps, of these events. So I will take any questions you have. Thank you.
All right, I'm unmuted. So why don't we start to get Ed's talk served up? I do want, so do we have any questions for Hillary? A quick one. Would you mind if I ask one just to get your opinion? So I'm sort of torn between, is it different physics, or is it the physics, the response we would expect given the physics, and maybe it's more atmospheric?
Yeah, it's kind of like the setup for the ability of these anomalies to get into subsurface. I haven't really touched on the physical mechanisms that cause these warm anomalies to appear in the first place, because I mean there's been studies that have really looked into that. But I think having the salinity really comes in to be an important factor in understanding how easily those surface anomalies can get into the subsurface. And so it's just like another important part of the picture to consider.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Hillary. That was great. And now I'm sure we're going to have another great talk from Ed Deaver, who's going to talk about PCO2 events using data from the OOI moorings. So Ed,
yeah, and thanks very much for your talk, Hillary, because it really does have a good connection with this talk. So I'm going to be moving closer into the coast to where the coastal endurance array is, but it's an area that we get coastal upwelling. It's all along the Pacific margin, we get really strong seasonal upwelling, and so some of those anomalies I think that are seen in blob 1.0 or the warm blob and blob 2.0, I think eventually they are starting to show up along the coast. And they have some, I thought, to me, at first surprising, but later on, not so surprising effects on PCO2. And it's kind of an interesting connection. This work is, I've got a poster tonight from 9 to 11 o'clock East Coast time. I hope you're there, Jim, for the whole time. Anyway, so I've got my poster there. And so some of the results that I'm going to show here today are are in that poster, but there's a few things that I'm going to look at from other researchers' results that are specific to this talk. But happy to talk later with folks about this. This is work that I've done with Chris Wingard here at Oregon State University. There's a bunch of related ocean science meeting presentations I've got there at the bottom, and Chris Wingard, Wendy Reef, Andrew Reed across OOI. They're part of the data team, and they've been looking at OOI data and OOI PCO2 data specifically, trying to understand the quality of that data, weed out the garbage and get it in the hands of people. And part of my original motivation for doing this is to take their work, take some of the time series they produced, and look at them in comparison to historical measurements of PCO2 and pH in the region. And here I'm going to stick mostly with PCO2 and look at some extreme events. So anyway, the measurements that I'm going to be talking about here, we have PCO2 at the Washington offshore site, the Washington shelf site, the Oregon offshore site, and the Oregon shelf site. That's air sea PCO2 on the buoys. We've also got other sensors that are near those that are on the buoys as well, that allow the interpretation of PCO2 in light of wind, temperature, salinity, nutrients, oxygen, all that kind of good stuff. And we started putting these buoys out really in 2015. So we've got records that go from 2015 up through the present time. So we're starting to get a time series that's long enough to look at impacts of seasonal processes, but also interannual processes, including marine heat waves. And yeah, so we're going to be looking at the buoys primarily. I'm going to focus a lot on this one right here, the Oregon shelf site in a minute. But first, we'll take a look at the measurement technologies, and then go on to the seasonal stuff, and then wrap up with some of the event stuff. On OOI, we use the Pro-Oceanus air sea PCO2 system, and I just wanted to mention, I don't think there's any air sea PCO2 buffs in the room right now or in the audience, but NOAA's made a big effort to look at air sea changes in PCO2. They use the Battelle MAP PCO2 system. We've used the Pro-Oceanus system, and I think we're one of the biggest users of this system, right? We contribute our data to GOON, the Global Ocean Acidification Observation Network, and I think almost all the measurements there are from the Battelle system. So getting a comparison between our measurements and the Battelle system, I think it's a useful kind of a thing. And you can see here they're mounted beneath the surface buoy at about 1 meter depth is where we've got the Pro-Oceanus system right there. And you can see that's a nice clean one, and then there's one that's kind of grubby after getting it back from the ocean. Every 6 months we do that. Chris Wingard earlier, back in 2020 at the Ocean Sciences meeting, he did a comparison between the air PCO2 and some water side PCO2 measurements. So the black and the red here, the red is coastal air side PCO2 measurements. The black is our buoy measurements. They're pretty close, right? It's around 400 microatmospheres, right? That's where we're at now in global warming land. And then the blue is our buoy measurements there from 2015. In this case, this is from the poster, so it's through late 2019, early 2020. And occasionally you can see a little yellow star or a little yellow circle right here. Those are either discrete bottle sample measurements from our cruise, where we dip it in the water to see how good the measurement is, or from the Lamont-Doherty PCO2 system. I think this is the late Taro Takahashi was the initiator of this. He's got some systems, or had some systems met. I mean, the systems are still there. He's not, but he's got some really nice measurements on the Sakuliak is one of the ships we use. And so we've got underway surface measurements of PCO2 there. And you can see they work pretty well. So one of the things that I did was I compared climatology to some peer-reviewed historical climatology. And I've done that for pH and for PCO2. And what I'm showing here, these are seasonal cycles derived from different types of measurements. So the orange are our buoys, right? So this is the Washington offshore buoy, which is the most northwest one. The Washington Shelf one, again, north of the Columbia River, but at 87 meters water depth. Oregon offshore, so continental slope, directly off of Newport, Oregon, if you remember back to that first slide, and then the Oregon Shelf measurement. The other types of data shown here, this black line right here, this is the Cape Elizabeth NDBC buoy, and that has one of the NOAA MAP PCO2 systems on it. And then the blue here, these are climatologies derived from bottle measurements. And a couple of things to note here, our data start in 2015 and they go through 2022. The black Cape Elizabeth measurement, that starts in about 2006 and goes through 2013. And then these bottle sample measurements, I think they're actually 1976 through 2013, but they're kind of adjusted to 2010 to kind of bring everything together on a climatological basis. They estimated, Fassbender et al. In their paper estimated 1.5 microatmospheres per year upward trend in PCO2. And there's about 9 years that separate our data from the Cape Elizabeth buoy. So that adds up to about 13.5 microatmospheres. So that explains some of the trends. But basically, we're getting a pretty good job doing, replicating the seasonal cycle. In the gray dots right here, these are individual months averaged together from the OOI data. And one of the things that kind of stands out is over here off the Oregon Shelf, there's a lot of interannual variability, especially in the summer, in that averaged data, in that monthly average data. So I wanted to take a look at that and kind of compare that to what was historically seen. And kind of the earliest work that was done was done by Wiley Evans as part of his PhD thesis at Oregon State University about now 15 years ago. And what he's showing here is early PCO2 measurements made near the surface using the Sunburst SAMI PCO2 measurement system. And you can see here in the summer of 2008, they observed PCO2 in excess of 1,100 microatmospheres. That's almost 3 times what atmospheric levels are. And they looked at this, they looked at bottle data, they looked at underway shipboard data. This is real high PCO2 water being brought to the surface by upwelling. And like I said, these are extreme events in PCO2. And what he did was he plotted that stuff up with other parameters, including wind, sea surface temperature, salinity, chlorophyll, dissolved oxygen, and then down here at the bottom is PCO2. And you can see here these high PCO2 spikes, again, over 1,000 microatmospheres, are associated with low dissolved oxygen, low chlorophyll, high salinity, and very cold water. So this is freshly upwelled water that's being brought to the surface, very high in PCO2, low in chlorophyll at the time. Once the chlorophyll kicks in, it actually draws down the PCO2, but that's when you see the spikes. So you might say to yourself, okay, here's these strong upwelling favorable winds, and we get cold water brought to the surface. Upwelling is clearly related to PCO2 on an event basis. So do you get stronger PCO2, bigger spikes during strong upwelling years? It seems like it would make sense to me. But actually, 2008, this is months across the top right here. This is a historical compilation of the strength of upwelling years done by Steve Pierce and Jack Barth at Oregon State University. So what they're doing is they're determining when upwelling started, and they're adding up all the upwelling favorable winds. So on the West Coast, when the wind is out of the north, that's upwelling favorable. So wind out of the north means it's a southward wind, different meteorological and oceanographic conventions here, but 2008 is right in the middle of the pack, right? So it's not a strong upwelling year. The strongest upwelling years were 2006, which we don't have OOI data for, and 2015 and 2021, which we do have OOI data. So the question is, are we seeing strong PCO2 maximum during these really strong upwelling years of 2015 and 2021? And if you're like ways, if you're smarter than me, quicker than me, you're maybe tying this already in with the warm blob. The answer is, in 2015, we saw very big spikes in very strong upwelling favorable winds, and we do see spikes in PCO2, right? But the spikes in PCO2 do not approach the ones that were seen by Evans et al. In 2008, which was merely an average upwelling year. And I think the answer is, if you look here, salinity is a little bit tough to see, right? You do get high salinity during a lot of these upwelling favorable events, but look at the temperature. It's only about 10 degrees here, and occasionally it gets a little bit lower. But that upwelled water is just not as cold as the upwelled water seen by Evans et al. Right? If you look at some of the SSTs there, they're getting down to 8 on a regular basis, and we're closer to 10. And then we go to 2021, also a strong upwelling favorable year. So these are the upwelling winds here. Whenever it's below 0, those are upwelling favorable. We are starting to see some cold, salty water with some spikes that are approaching those seen by Evans et al., but still not quite at the same level. And when we plot that up in temperature and salinity space, the temperature here is on the horizontal axis, salinity is on the vertical axis, and then the color corresponds to the level of PCO2. You can see here in 2021, which is the X's, the highest PCO2 occurs for the coldest, saltiest upwelled water. And then when you look at 2015, which are the dots, they don't really get to anything it's not in that same high temperature salinity region. And it's also, if you look at the colors, not as high in PCO2. And so what's happening there is, I believe, in 2014 and 2016, we've got some evidence of that warm blob coming on shore. And Craig Rizian had looked at this with some of the OOI profiler data off of Washington. The water that's being upwelled, the wind is screaming, we're getting strong up in Ekman transport, but the water that's actually being upwelled is just a little bit warmer, a little bit less salty, and significantly lower in PCO2. So in conclusion, the OOI PCO2 or fugacity FCO2 data, they're consistent with other data. There's geographic variability that I didn't talk too much about here in terms of the timing and magnitude of the seasonal cycle. There's strong PCO2 variability that's associated with synoptic meteorology. And while that wind forcing is important, there are underlying changes in the source of the upwelling source water that affect the carbonate system. And in some ways, this is kind of nice because hypoxia and ocean acidification are big problems off of Oregon and in other upwelling systems. And so on some level, having a little bit of reduction in the PCO2 during upwelling is a small offset, a small mercy to the reduction in nutrient inputs that can be caused by some of these marine heat wave events along the coast that Hillary talked about. And like I said, there's a ton of this stuff is pure gold as far as I'm concerned. Long-term trends, diurnal variability, relationships to other important variables like nitrate are still largely unexplored in these data, right? My role was mostly, I wanted to look at the data, make sure that it looks like historical data, see if we understand the events, and I think that that's true. And with that, I'll take some questions. And I know and I know we've got questions from the other talks as well in the remaining 6 minutes or so. Thank you.
All right, Ed, all three of you, terrific job. Let's just open it up for questions. If you have one, please use the raise your hand feature and we'll get them asked. I don't see any on the chat right now. I mean, I'm more than happy to start things off. And I guess this would be for Ed. Well, it's actually for all of you because it deals with stratification. The thing about CO2, which is so fascinating, is it's a waterside controlled gas, right? So, you know, all the gradient is on the water side. And that's, so the bottleneck is kind of at the air sea interface. So you would expect that stratification would have an important role on the CO2 itself, CO2 levels. And so if I'm just sort of imagining that you have upwelling CO2 rich water, and during these times when you have, the blobs, right, they're going to kind of stay put in the surface waters, I think. Does that make sense? Or are they more likely to evade during those periods? So I'm trying to think if you got those spikes. I mean, that's amazing.
So
I mean, you're seeing levels that you only see well upstream of estuaries, right? Like at the source of an estuary, you see CO2 levels that high.
Yeah.
And here we're seeing them just in the coastal ocean, which is really, really remarkable. And I'm trying to think of what physics kind of keeps that. And it seems like there's this, like you were saying, a relationship between these, the blobs and what processes are driving those and high levels of CO2 beyond the, upwelling strength.
Yeah, I'm hardly an expert in CO2, but I think what's happening is, regardless of the strength of the wind forcing, there's kind of a limit that you're drawing water up from when you have coastal upwelling. And on the West Coast, that limit seems to be, something like 250 or 300 meters or something like that. So if the source waters are going to come from the same depth, and if you're changing the source waters at that depth, whether through a blob type of event or long-term changes in the temperature, salinity, oxygen, et cetera, characteristics of that source water, then you're going to change what comes up to the surface when you have active upwelling. And once it gets up to the surface, as you said, there'll be biology starts happening, and air-sea transfer of CO2 starts happening very quickly. And what I didn't emphasize is those big spikes in PCO2, as far as the OOI array goes, we really only see them at the Oregon shelf site. The spikes that we see off Washington, the Washington shelf, are smaller. I think it's because the upwelling is not as intense. And then the spikes that we see at the offshore sites are much smaller, I think because the water has been at the surface long enough to start to be affected by the biology, drawing down the CO2 and air-sea exchange. So, it's the kind of thing where I think most of our audience are folks that are sort of familiar with OOI, but it's the kind of thing where if you have a ship and you want to do surface PCO2 mapping, I think that would be a pretty interesting thing to do, right, around the OOI arrays and kind of understand that. And anyway, and for what it's worth, I'll also say that a couple students have done work in the near the Pioneer array is part of summer REU stuff as well, and looked at PCO2 variability. And those students were working with Rachel Eveleth out of Oberlin University a couple of years ago.
Very good. Any other, panelists, like Darlene, please feel free.
I'd like to say that all of the presentations were really great. Thank you. But I have a question for Chen. Since your work is with the Pioneer Array data, what are you going to do in 2024 to carry on your studies when the Pioneer moves? Do you have a solution?
Well, I think nevertheless, the Pioneer data will be further utilized, after the relocation. So I think there's a ton of information to dig into. For example, the case I showed is just 1 year, one event, right? So I think it's going to be really interesting to look at the past few years, looking at the long-term sort of this occurrence, like a frequency and the intensity of this type of events, and how that is manifested in the Pioneer data. Because one value I see from the Pioneer array is it sort of give you the like a precursor of the offshore intrusion. Not every high salinity, high temperature signal detected at Pioneer means that we will penetrate all the way to the inner shelf. But I think that's a more like a necessary condition for this type of event to happen. So I'm interested in actually to look at the long-term record at the Pioneer to see how frequent or whether or not a high salinity event or high temperature event at the Pioneer will mean that we will see something very anomalous over the shelf, especially inner shelf.
Mhm.
So that's something I can easily, think of.
Yeah.
And also, let me just say, I think the mobile asset in Pioneer, my impression is still needs to be better utilized than those gliders and AUVs. So that will be another, area for people to look into further.
Thank you.
So, and just one more point, of course, it is being moved, but the data ain't going anywhere. So, we have 5 years of amazing data that we've just barely touched, the surface. So I imagine as people discover more and more the quality of the data that we've been collecting for the past, 5 years or so, it'll just be used more and more. And then we will gradually, migrate down to the southern mid-Atlantic bight and start using that data as we build up time series, where we may have a little bit more of a focus on the biogeochemical aspects. And this is, what Ed was talking about. We've got this amazing wealth of information on both sides of the continent. And in fact, this is how I'll end my little spiel. Tomorrow we'll be looking at carbon studies and the use of OOI data for just that. So, some of the things that Ed's been talking about and Hillary and Ka are all going to be, I think, important considerations when you look at the carbon budget as well. And I'm hoping that some PIs propose at some point to put CO2 systems on the buoys or nearby to directly measure the exchange of CO2, because these time series could just, they're just so valuable to have to look at things like the impact of stratification and other things on the actual exchange of CO2. So with that, unless there's any more questions, I look forward to people tuning in at 3 tomorrow, and I want to give our 3 panelists one more round of applause. Those really would great talks. They've been recorded, so that I'm going to definitely tell people they should check them out, because those are really well done. So I hope the people that joined us enjoyed it. I certainly did, and we'll see you